So today's lecture is on Intro to C Sharp. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to start off from the very beginning here. We're going to create a brand new application. So I'm going to right click down here, do a Visual Studio, just to show you from the very beginning on how you actually create a project. So we open Visual Studio, and do File, New Project, just like you've seen before. But here now, you'll notice that on the end, we've got these various project types. So rather than desktop, I'm going to choose a console application and just do a console app. Now, the rest, it's very rare that you're going to use a console application, but it's easy for our purposes to kind of start off that way. So this is a code from the book, figure 3.1. So let's just kind of walk through it so we can just see the different aspects of our program here. So let's go ahead and just start at the very top, and you'll see this using statement. So this using statement is a way of including a namespace within your program. Other programming languages you may see like import, something in there, pound include, something of that nature. But what this is really saying is this namespace, it's just a reference. So over here in our references, you'll notice we've got this system namespace. Now this is a DLL from the .NET library. You can see system.dll. So this is the code that Microsoft has written for you already. So we don't have to, for instance, reinvent. So now once we've referenced that in our project, we can use any of the code that Microsoft has written for us. So we include this DLL, which is done for us automatically, but we could have right-clicked here, done add reference, and we could actually include any DLL we want. Someone could give you a DLL and you could use that code here, but just to keep it simple for now, just understand that this was, the project came with this included here. And so what we can now do is by using system over here, we have access to all the classes, all the code that Microsoft has already written for us inside this system namespace. So for example, you'll notice if I start typing console and I highlight this, you can see class system.console. So what that is saying is that the console class is contained within the system namespace. Now what we can also do is let's come up here, watch what happens now if I comment this out. So now that it's commented out, you can see that Visual Studio is telling you, hey, I don't know what it means to be a console class. And so if you even just highlight this, you can see this little drop down here, and it tries to figure it out for you. Now it was able to figure it out because it knew that you've included the system reference here for that namespace. And so it was able to say, hey, I noticed that there's a console class inside this system namespace. Is that really what you meant? So do you want to put a using statement at the top, or do you want to say system.console? So see how this is exactly the same as this if we have this using statement up here. So let me uncomment that. So you can see now these two lines are exactly the same. We can see if I highlight this, it's the system namespace. So that's all namespaces, and this little using statement up here is for. It's just an organization. Think of the namespace as sort of like a Windows folder that can contain all kinds of classes and attributes, just various things. So for example, let's say system dot, and as you can see, if I scroll up and down here, this is everything that's contained within that system namespace. And so every namespace you can do this, and you can see what's inside of it. For our purposes here, we're just going to be keeping it simple using the console class. So Microsoft wrote this console class for us, so now let's go ahead and use it, and we're going to write out to the console. So there's a couple different methods that we can use. We can use the write method, or we can use the WriteLine method. So if I come back in here, and you can see my IntelliSense pop up. If I say dot write, you can see it comes up here, and then I have some text that pops up that tells me how to use this method. This comment down here at the bottom, when we talk about XML commenting, that's why this pops up for the console.write class. So when you hear me talk about XML comments, it's very important that you always use XML comments for your methods, your classes, and your class attributes, which we're going to continually go over in these lectures. But for here, you can see on our write method, you can see that it tells you our parameters. So we have to pass in some sort of string, and there's these things called overloads, which we'll talk about. Or we could look at the WriteLine method. So the difference between the two is write puts everything on one line, WriteLine does a carriage return, after the write. So for here example, here's the first write and the second right? So what's going to happen is when this prints this out to the console, it's actually going to be concatenated together. Where if I had done a WriteLine right here, it would have put them on two separate lines. Now here I'm just using a WriteLine statement just to put a new line character in between what we're writing here and what we're going to write here. So now this statement, we're actually going to have a WriteLine, so it's going to actually now return onto the WriteLine. So let's just run this program and take a look at what it's like. So I'm just going to click the Start button here, click Run, and then move this over here. So let's just focus on this, first, second. So you can see because I used the write, I have first and second, and it's concatenated together. Now I did WriteLine, which moved it down to the next line here, and then Welcome to C# Programming. And this was WriteLine, so it went down to the next lines down here. So let's now take a look at our code for what else we can do within this console.WriteLine. So there's these things called escape characters. And so these escape characters allow you within a string, so you can see how this is just a string here. A C# string has open and close quotes, but sometimes within our string we want to print other characters. So for instance, a new line character, a tab character, if you want to print a backslash, or if you want to actually print a quote, you use this backslash or this escape character in order to do that. And so when N means new line, T means tab, backslash actually prints the backslash, and this is how you print a quote. So now if I were to run this, and I move this down here, you can see that, test the new line, so it actually printed a new line between test and new line. You can see the tab right here, and then the backslash and the quote printed for a console application here. So that's sort of the basics of a C# program, a console-based program. So let's go ahead and move on now, and let's talk about message boxes. So here we just have a Windows Forms application, and this is an example from the class. Oh, that it's not happy with there. Let's go ahead and bring up the code. All right, let's try this again. So go ahead and double click the form here. I can also right click on it and do View Code to see the code behind. Let's come back to our UI now. And on our UI, you can see I've got a text box here. And if I scroll to the top, you can see it's just called text box 1, but don't always make sure you name your UI controls. Here's our button here, and it's called Command Click Me. So what we're going to do now is we're going to double click this button, and you can see that it's going to take me to the method that gets called when I click that button. But let's go ahead and start back at the top. Now you'll notice we've got all these various using statements. Now here's one we haven't seen before, using system.windows.forms. So this entire thing is a namespace. So just like on Windows how you can have folders within folders, in C# you can have namespaces within namespaces. And it's just a different way of organizing the code. So within this system.windows.forms namespace, again, we've got this reference over here, system.windows.forms. So this is a DLL, the system.windows.forms.dll that Microsoft has written for us so that we don't have to write code for a button, a form, a label, a message box, things like that. So that's why this system.using.forms is so important up here. Now again, we could comment this out and we would just have to fully qualify, for instance, a message box here. But it's easier just to leave that there. So now let's take a look. And let's just start at the top again, where I want to just show you the XML commenting. So if I do 3 forward slashes, 1, 2, 3, you can see that this is the comment for a class. And so this comment is now associated with our Form1 class. If we come down a little bit further, and this is our constructor, but it's just a method. So if I type 3 forward slashes, this method comment is now for this Form1 constructor. And that's how this was created here for this click me. So let me get rid of this just for a second. Now if I do 3 forward slashes, you can see that it actually gives me these XML comments for the parameters themselves. Now later on we'll talk more about methods and parameters and things like that, but I just wanted to show you how the XML commenting actually pops up and defines those for you. So now I'm going to go ahead and put the original comment back. And so what we're going to try to do now is when the user clicks our button, we want to take this message, whatever they've put into this message box, and display it to the user using what's called a message box. We'll talk about this dialog result in just one second, but let's take a look at the Messagebox class. So if I type Messagebox, you can see my IntelliSense pops up here, and I can just press Tab and it'll insert the message box. Now you can see it's already starting to figure out the code. It's trying to say, hey, I think you probably want the show method, but let's just kind of start typing that. And you can see with my show method, I can now open this, and it's going to give us all these different overloads for our method. And if I click all the way down here to number 7, this is actually the one we're going to use, but you could use any of them. And what that means is you can just pass in different number of parameters for this method. This particular one, you can see you can pass in the text of the string you want to display, the caption of the message box, what type of buttons to show on the message box, and the icon to show on the message box. So this will make a little more sense as we actually start doing this. So let's do something like this where we're going to say hello, comma, and you can see how it actually jumps over here to string caption. So this is the caption. And now, did you see what I did there? When I open that, see how it actually puts 2 braces for me? So let's type that again. This is the caption. Now what I do is I just actually type this last character here, and it doesn't print it again, it just skips over it. Now if I do this and I press spacebar and we do Messagebox Buttons. Now the reason I knew it was Messagebox Buttons is because it told me that right here. And you can see this is something called an enumeration. We'll learn more about enumerations later, but this is just a way of defining what possible values, they only allow. You can't pass in a string here. It has to be this enumeration of type Messagebox Buttons. So let's do something called, how about OK Cancel? And so what that's going to say is on our message box, we want to see an OK button and a cancel button. So the next one, we're going to type in these Messagebox Icons. So here's our icon, dot, and you can see there's question or error, exclamation. Let's try that one. And so what it's saying here is that when I click this button, I want it to display this message box. It's going to say hello. This is going to be the caption. It's going to show me 2 buttons, which are OK and cancel, and this exclamation point. So let me go ahead and run this. And the first thing it's going to do, you can see, is pop up this message box that I said. So you can see here's my message that says hello. This is the caption, which comes up. Here's the caption. You can see I've said to show the OK and cancel button. So here's an OK, here's a cancel button, and then the exclamation point, which is right here. So hopefully you can kind of see, we'll just ignore that for now, that based on what you pass in here, you can make your message box look differently. So I would recommend you go in and play with the different types of buttons and icons. So now let me go ahead and just comment out this code. And let's take a look at the message box that they created for us, or for our example program. So we're doing a message box, and we're going to now deliver a message to the user where it says you typed plus this. And so what we've actually done here is we've first created this string here. So this is, hey, we have a string we want to print to our message box, but oh, by the way, concatenate onto that string the text that's within our text box. So if we go back over to our text box right here, you'll notice that there's this text property. So if you're to type anything you want into that text property, it's going to show the text inside the text box. So that's what we're doing. We're saying, hey, grab the text that the user typed, and we're just going to give them a little bit message, and then print the message, and then some OK buttons. Now, the thing about the show method, if I highlight this, you can see it actually returns what's called a dialog result. See this right here? So show returns us a dialog result. Now the dialog result, I've set this variable right here, and the dialog result allows us to see what the user clicked. So for instance, the yes or no button in this case. So it'll make more sense, I think, as I run the code. So let's go ahead and run it. And let's open the code here. And so let's just type ABC, click the button. You can see you typed ABC and it has a yes or no. So let's go ahead and click no. And it says you clicked the no button. Now it's because of this line right here where I got the result and then I said my result dot to string. So result, I just had to then turn it into a string in order to show it to the user. And so again, you can see this is an enumeration. We'll talk more about that later on. I'm just going to kind of go over that now, where you just have to say the enumeration and then dot to string. So this just prints out what they clicked of that yes or no button. So that's for how you do message boxes in a Windows program. So now I want to go back to a console program now, and we're going to take a look at some basic integer division. So this is figure 3.14 from the book Examples. And again, it's just another console application. So what it's going to do now is as soon as the program starts, and remember all C# programs have to start with the main method. Every C# program, and that's a test question. Make sure you remember that. Now here we're learning something new. We're going to start now storing data into variables. So I would assume you've seen variables before. So just like other programming languages, you just say the variable type, and then your variable name. Now in C#, as you talk, we have things like doubles, ints, we have strings, char, all these different types that we can store our data in. And so for this program, we're just going to be using some very basic integers to store our numbers. So you can see here we declared a variable called number1, number2, and sum. Now you'll also notice that when I, for instance, click on number1 here, it's kind of nice because it shows you everywhere in the program that that variable is used. So you can quickly see, where a bug may be or where you may need to modify your code. So the first line of the program here says enter the first integer. So all we're doing is prompting the user. And now we actually want to get some input from the console. So we use this Console.Read line. So remember, we had all these references up here, and in the system namespace, Microsoft wrote this console class for us, and they wrote the write method, they wrote the ReadLine method. So there's a lot of code behind this, but we just can use it. We don't have to understand how it works. So now after the user enters it, the program waits, and we're going to read from the console, and we're going to put that into number1. But you'll notice if I highlight ReadLine, it says it's a string. So we can't put a string into an integer in C#. We have to actually what's called cast it. And so in order to cast a string into an integer, there's various ways, but this first way is something called int.parse. And so you just say int dot, and you can see it comes up. Now there's parse and there's try-parse. I would recommend always using try-parse. But for right now, let's take a look at parse. So all it does is it takes this string, so let's say the user entered 3, it would convert it to an integer type and store that in our number here. Then it's going to print out, hey, enter your second integer, read that into integer 2, and now we want to do something with those numbers. So here's our two variables, and you can see we've got number1 plus number2, and we're putting that into our variable sum. So just like math, we got plus, we have minus, we have divide. So we have all these different operators that we can use in order to calculate our data. So in this case, we're just going to add them together. Now, the console class has these Writeline methods that are overloaded. There's different ways that you can print out the data. It's kind of up to you. It's just sort of your preference on how you want to display the data. So this particular syntax where you use the $sign, and then you can see these brackets and then the variable name here. So this is a way of just saying, hey, replace this stuff here with the actual value of which is sum. Another way you can do that is use this bracket 0, and this says the 0 index, so this first element is what I want you to replace this value for. Now the way I prefer to do it is this one here. I feel like this is more readable, and it's just, hey, create this string, sum is, and then concatenate on that the value that is in sum. Now at the end here I put this console.read line because I want to make sure the program stops and just pauses, because if you don't have this, the program will just exit when you run it. So let's go ahead and run this now, and we can see now that enter your first integer, so that's our code right here, and you'll notice it's right, so that's why the console is just stopped right here. So let's go ahead and put 3, press enter, put 2, now enter your second integer, press 3, and press enter. Now if we come down here, you'll notice it printed the same thing out 3 times. So that's just showing you that this syntax here, you can do the exact same thing, just different syntax. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to another console program. This is figure 322 from the book. And there's a few new concepts that this is going to introduce. So let's just kind of walk through and see what this program does. So first off, we're just going to get an integer from the console again, read that into a variable called integer, do the exact same thing for another one. And again, I recommend using try-parse, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then once we've got those, now we're going to start doing some if statements and comparing these numbers together. So I'm going to click here to get rid of this breakpoint for just 1 second. So with our if statement, again, if I start typing if, you can see that it even starts putting in some text for me. So I could do something like number 2, and now I need to say I want number 2 equal to something, I want it less than something, greater than something in order to complete this if statement. And you can see that when I hit this, my open bracket and my close bracket, it'll actually finish those for me. Now with C#, you have to make sure you put the opening and close bracket, and you also have to make sure you do these parentheses. Now there's order of operations, so just like in math, if you have parentheses within these parentheses, it's going to do those first. So always keep that in mind. Now, if I were to have some syntax error, like for example, let's delete this, and now let's try to run it, and you can see that it's not successful in doing this. So if I were to come up here and look at my error list and double click this, you can see it's actually going to take me, and it's trying to do the best it can, but you can see it's a little confused now because it doesn't know where this other last bracket should be. But I'm going to go ahead and delete this out. Let's kind of go back to the program now. So this program, what it's going to do is after getting these first two numbers, it's going to say, hey, are these two numbers equal to each other? Now this is something in C# you really need to be careful of, in that when you're testing for equality, it's a double equal sign and not an equal sign. This is assigning this one into this one. And you can see in C# this is not a valid syntax. And something like C or C++ this is, I think that is a terrible sort of way to write it. So in C# you have to use the double equal sign. So if number 1 is equal to number 2, then do these statements. And again, I'm just showing you two different ways that you can print out this data. So here we're just printing out number equals number 1, or here it actually replaces these with these variables here. Now as we go down, this if statement is going to say if number 1 does not equal number 2, print this out. So you can see it's actually, if let's say number 1 does not equal number 2, it's going to skip over this if statement here and go to this line here. Here it's saying if number 1 is less than number 2, print this out. Number 1 is greater than. We got less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. So now I kind of want to show you how to debug your programs. So if I come over here and I just click a debug point here, and now I click run, you can see that it hit this debug point. Now there's various things. I could just click this run button here and it would just continue on. Or if you come up to the debug, you can start seeing some of the different things that quick keys we can use. For instance, I use F10 a lot. So step over. Step into means you're going to step into the method. But let's go ahead and just press F10 here, and you can see it now executes that line of code, and it'll actually print this out to the console now. Now the next line of code is you'll see it's going to then ask the user, hey, enter in a number. So if I press F10 there, you can see it actually pops up my program because now it's waiting for the user to do something. So if I do 5 enter, you can see it jumps back into my program, and now I can press F10. Now F10 again, it's going to pop back up for my second number. Let's do 7. Press enter, and now we can actually take a look and see what the program's doing because we're debugging. So I can highlight number 1, and sure enough it tells me the number is 5, or I can highlight number 2 and you can see it tells me the value is number 7. And so I can actually even click in here and I can actually change the value. So let's change that to 4. So real time, while it's debugging now, this value, this variable now contains 4, where this value contains 7. Now if I press F10, you can see that it jumps over this statement because number 1 does not equal number 2. Some other windows that I have up here, let's get rid of this one, a couple of these. We don't need to see breakpoints, various windows, we don't need any of those. So now you'll notice we've got this window called autos. So if I were to come up here to some of my menu up here, I'm going to show you how you can get to some of the different menus that I have down here at the bottom, like autos or things like that. So if we go debug to Windows, we can open up the watch window or the autos window, and they're already open up down here, or the locals window. So autos and locals are they're just going to show you the variables that are in scope that we can now see. So you'll notice here's number 1, number 2. So it automatically put those down there for us. It told us the type, and here's the value. Watch window, press delete here, is I'm going to copy number 1 and I'm going to paste it down here. Watch says enter some formula, enter a variable, press enter, and you can see here's my value. Now I can also change it here. So I can change number 5. You see this is number 1. If I come up here and highlight number 1, you can see now it holds 5, where number 2 holds 7. Now what's also interesting is I can click this little yellow arrow over here and I can drag where the program is executing back up to this. So let's say I wanted to test this statement. So if I really want to, I could change this to a 5. And so now number 1 equals number 2. So now when I do F10, you can see now it's going to come in here and print this out. But now number 1, does it not equal number 2? Nope. Is that less than that? Is that greater than that? Is that less than or equal to that? Yes. So it's going to print that out. Is that greater than or equal? Yes. So it's going to print that out. And then I'm going to press F5 to continue on running. And you can see here's our output for the program. So it's going to print out everything that we said there. So that's kind of the basics of debugging, and I highly recommend that you just continually play with that debugger and get used to it, because this will help you so much of just walking through your code and figuring out the bugs and how the problems show up. So the next one here now, let's go to another console program. And let's talk about some different types of variables and some new concepts. So in this particular program now, we're going to say, okay, I just wanted to show you some different things about commenting. So this Console.Read line, we're showing this is a comment for this line of code. Now if I were to come up here, and let's say I said int I my variable, this is a class level variable where these are local variables, these ones down here. So again, we always want to make sure we comment our variables, and so you'd put some sort of comment in here. Now because this is a class variable, I can use this throughout my program. So if I just start typing I, you can see that it's going to figure out my var is going to be usable in our method here. So for our particular example, let's just go ahead and delete this and come back to our main method now. And inside here, it's going to start executing. It's going to print out this hello world. We're going to read line, so it's going to just kind of pause there. Here I'm showing you some escape characters again. And then we're going to read line in. Now we're going to create some variables. Now we haven't created a string before, so just a string is just a string of characters. And you can see that in order to set our string, we need to say equals and then whatever our message is. So this is how you assign a string in C# to our string variable. Now what I've decided to do here is I've broken it out. Before we did the Console.Read and the conversion all on one line, but I wanted to break it out so it's a little bit easier to understand. So first we're going to tell the user enter a number, and then we're going to do the Console.Read line. But remember, this returns an integer, so we're going to return this first number. Or put it into the first number. Then we're going to do the same thing for the second number. We're going to read it and put it into this string variable. Well, we want to do some addition, for example. So because of that, we need to convert this string to an integer type. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. One is this int32.tryParse. So again, I talked about this before, where you don't really want to use int.32.parse. Now because of that, is if you entered in the letter A and tried to do this, it would actually crash your program because it doesn't make sense to convert the letter A to an int32. Also, the reason this says int32, if I were to highlight this up here, this integer variable, it's just a shorthand for system.int32, a 32-bit integer. So that's an int. This is a 32-bit int that we're trying to put it into. Now tryParse is interesting because it actually tells us, returns a Boolean true or false if this conversion is true. So what this says is take first number, and if possible, return that casted integer into this variable called iFirstNumber that we created right here. So what this is doing for us is we pass in first number, and it passes back out, hence this out keyword, which we'll learn more about later on. For right now, just kind of understand that you have to put this out word right there. But that just means that this variable is getting returned out from this method. So if let's say we put 2 into our first number. 2 goes in here as a string, but it comes out as an integer right here. Now we could have put this within an if statement. So for instance, something like this. And we could have said, if this equals true, do something, or if it equals false, do something. Because again, remember, this turns true or false. So if you could do this and then tell the user, hey, you entered in an invalid value, for example. So let's go ahead and get rid of the if statement now and come back to here. So now we're going to pull out our integer, and we've tried to cast it. Now here's again the way you wouldn't want to do it, because this could potentially crash our program if you entered a letter. But now we've got our first number, our second number. We're going to go ahead and add those together. Now this is going to be a little bit interesting. You'll notice that I'm actually displaying a text box here. Well, hold on a second here. This is a console application. This is not a Windows Forms application. So, but what I wanted to try to get across to you is that in this application, what I actually did is I manually came in here and I added system.windows.forms. Now, because I added that DLL, I included all of the code for forms, like message boxes, labels, things like that. I also included the using statement at the top here. Now, I didn't have to do this, but it's just shorthand, so I don't have to type system.windows.forms every time. So even though this is a console application, I'm now calling the Messagebox class because I've included that DLL and I've included this using statement up here. So now I'm just going to pop up a message box, even though from my console application, and I'm going to print out the message. The sum of the first number and the second number is this value. And then I'm just going to have an OK cancel and exclamation point. Then just some very simple if statements to see if the first number is greater than the second number. I'm going to print this one out. Otherwise, I'm going to print this message out. So let's go ahead and run it. Again, here's a console application. There's the hello world. And so now let's go ahead and press enter. And you can see that it's going to print out some information. Let me recompile this. Make sure I'm running the right thing. Run that hello world, press enter. Oh, enter the first number, so there's 0. Let's do 3. Now here's my message box that got executed. The sum of 0 and 3 is 3. Press that, it goes to the next message box to print that open. And so again, from even a console application, I could call this Messagebox class because I added that DLL. So I think that's about all for today's lecture. So hopefully that made sense. And just go through the different operators and play with the debugger, and I think it'll start to sink in as you use Visual Studio more and more.